Today I'm going to go over why the Edsel failed. The Edsel was probably the biggest automotive failure of all time, and I'm going to go over the reasons why I believe the Edsel failed, and I'm going to debunk reasons that other people put forth for the failure. To me, the biggest reason is quality. The Edsel did have quality that was below that of other vehicles being manufactured at the time that it competed with, as well as lower quality than other cars being manufactured by Ford at the time. A big reason for this is because Ford never dedicated a home factory to Edsel. This left the Edsel line without any quality control. Every 10th or 20th car down the assembly line was an Edsel, and the way Ford built them was they'd build like 20 Fords in a row, then an Edsel, then they'd build 20 more Fords in a row, then another Edsel. They didn't build them in batches or anything. This forced workers to change tools and part bins for the one Edsel that came down the line and then switch back. Time allowances weren't made for these changeovers. This led to parts being poorly fitted, mismatched, or left off entirely. Unattached parts were simply missing or put in a trunk for the dealer owner to finish assembling the car. And many times the Edsels would have instruction sheets put in there with the parts, basically letting the people know that, hey, we didn't build your car right, here's how you can fix it. So word soon spread that Edsels were just poorly manufactured vehicles. Another issue that the Edsel had was the Teletouch transmission. This thing had a control unit that was mounted low beside the transmission, where it was exposed to water and salt, which caused failure. Another issue was that the wires going from the push button selector and the steering wheel down to the control unit were routed too close to the exhaust manifold, which caused them to heat up, and that could cause the transmission to change gears, and it also led to total failure of the transmission as well. Over 90% of all 1958 Edsels had a Teletouch transmission installed in them. Another big issue was Edsel's E475 410 cubic inch engines. The Edsel had two engines installed in it that were both standalone Edsel engines, but neither one was actually related to the other. The E475 was based on a short-lived Lincoln engine. The mechanics were very wary of this engine due to its flat head and lack of distinct combustion chambers. Motor Trend tested one of these engines for just over 4,200 miles and used a quart of oil for every 188 miles. That means you'd be putting a quart of oil in your engine every time you stop to buy gas, roughly. To give a comparison, the Motor Trend at the same time tested a Edsel with a 361 in it, and the 361 did use 1 quart of oil in the first 3,000 miles. So it was a far better engine. It was more in line with what was probably going on at the time. Popular Mechanics released an article in March of 1958, which was halfway through the model year. In that article, they surveyed owners, and over 30% of them stated that they had engine trouble. Owners listed the biggest complaint with the Edsel, meaning they had to pick one issue and say which one was the worst. 16% said poor workmanship. Nearly 8% said either the power steering or engine issues. Close to 7% said body noise. And another 6% said poor paint job. So you gotta look at this was basically within the first 6 months the car was made. Between 45 and 50% of the owners were complaining about quality issues. A lot of people defend the Edsel, trying to say the quality wasn't that bad, but it was definitely worse than other cars being built at the time. They'll also say that other poor quality cars were in the market in the history of the automobile, but bad quality cars fell in the market. Two examples is the Sterling on the left and the Yugo on the right. The Sterling's from the early 90s. The Yugo's from the late 80s, and both of those were failures, and mainly because they were very poor quality vehicles. The next biggest issue I think that hurt Edsel was actually styling. You can look at the 58 Edsel on the left or the 58 Pontiac on the right. The Edsel was aimed to compete directly with Pontiac. The Pontiac's a much better looking vehicle, and if you consider what type of styling people liked at the time, many people would pick the best looking car of the 50s as being the 57 Chevy. The Pontiac certainly has more in common styling wise with the 57 Chevy than the 58 Edsel did. So in the eyes of the people at the time, the Edsel was an odd-looking car that wasn't very good-looking either. A big point of contention of the styling was the horse collar grille. This year's designers were too worried about road recognition. They wanted to create a car that you could easily identify from far away, but by focusing solely on making the car look different from existing models, rather than making the Edsel aesthetically appealing to customers, they made a big mistake. Basically, the stylers were successful in making a car that looked different, but people didn't want something that just looked different. They wanted something that they liked the look of, which is where they failed. One thing they did was they settled early on a tall vertical grille for the Edsel. Basically, this forced them to try to put this big grille on the front of the car no matter what. The grille was termed by many as a horse collar, a toilet seat, a part of the female anatomy, or even an Oldsmobile sucking on a lemon, which was a line famously said by Bob Hope. So the Edsel was known as an odd or unattractive vehicle, as well as one with low quality. I think part of this, where Ford shot itself in the foot, was that they decided not to sell body shells to Studebaker-Packard. In 1957, Studebaker-Packard had a set of cars designed that if Ford had sold them body shells, they would have went forth with. The car on the left is the Packard Predictor. It is a show car that had pretty good reception at the time when it was shown. And on the right is a clay mock-up of what a 57 Packard would have looked like had it been built on the Ford body shells. Packards would have been put on Lincoln body shells. They had a midline clipper for 1 year in 56, but they kind of got rid of it after that. But they would have kept that on the Mercury body shell. And then Studebaker would have been a low-priced car on the Ford body shell. If you look at the car on the right, though, if this would have come out in 57, the Edsel wouldn't have looked so odd when it came out in 58. Plus, Edsel would have had an association appearance-wise with Packard, which is a luxury car brand that was high prestige. So had they sold these body shells to Packard Studebaker, they probably would have helped Edsel at least somewhat in sales, as it would have not been seen as such an unattractive car, maybe. If you don't think poor exterior styling can kill a car, a good example is the Pontiac Aztek. These were well-built, reliable vehicles. They had a lot of interior features people liked. They had a lot of utility to them. The thing that really hurt them was the styling. If they would have been built to look like the Torrent on the right, they probably would have sold well. But the Aztek, with all the good things it had, people just couldn't get past the styling, so it didn't sell well. And basically, the Aztek was killed by styling alone, even being a good car otherwise. I'm going to show you a few Edsel design concepts. I found most of these online. The upper left was an early design concept. Looks kind of like a 53 or 4 Studebaker. I think most of these look better than the products Edsel actually put out. Even the one on the bottom left would have been a 58 or 59, it would have been more attractive than the actual vehicle released. Another page of these, the one in the upper middle, was actually a concept someone wanted the 59 Edsel to be, but they decided to go with a grille that looked more like the 58 rather than the one on this picture. And if you look at the bottom left, this is what the actual original Edsel designer wanted the 60 to look like, but he was overruled and they went in a completely different direction. I got another page here for you. These are all early design concepts, and late 50s, sometime in 57 is when they decided to go to quad headlamps. So these are probably all from 55, 56, maybe very early 57, because quad headlamps came out in 57 on some Chrysler products, and then they became really big. In fact, most cars made in 58 actually had quad headlamps. If you look here, you can see the 59 Edsel on the left, 60 Edsel on the right. The 59 still carries most of the design cues of the 58, which by associating itself with the 58 styling, it probably didn't help itself at all. So it has the vertical grille much better. I think the grille styling is way better, and the headlights are way better in this, but still, you have that. It kind of looks like a bird's beak to me. Although they changed the taillights to be much more pleasing, they still had that basic line on the trunk. It was better, but not a lot better. And on the right, you have a 60 Edsel, which was completely different. This is actually an attractive vehicle, but by the time this came out, it was just too late to save the Edsel. Plus, it wasn't just styling that killed it, remember, the quality issues. And even if the quality issues were fixed by 1960, which they probably were, the issue was that it had that reputation with it. Well, it should be noted that they did cancel the 60 model early on. The original Edsel come out to begin in September, and they did cancel the 60 model. They quit producing them in the middle of November. But in 2 months, they only made about 2,800 60 Edsels, and there was a hard sell to even sell the 2,800 that they made. The Edsel was dead by this point. Ford would have just lost more and more money to try to keep this thing going. A lot of people like to blame Robert McNamara. I don't believe he's really at fault, even though he was dead set against the Edsel division. The moves he made actually didn't kill it. They probably actually helped it. The things he's most known for are ruining the Thunderbird, taking it from the beautiful car that it is in 1957 and changing it. This was the 57 T-Bird on the left. He's also known for the Vietnam disaster as Lyndon Johnson's right-hand man during Vietnam. He was the Secretary of Defense at the time. Robert McNamara was a bean counter. Basically, it'd be like putting an accountant in charge of a car company, which is not a good idea. He was not a car guy. He didn't understand consumers' wants, needs, or desires. Not only did he ruin the Thunder, but he discontinued the beautiful car here on the left, the Continental Mark II. He wanted to completely eliminate Lincoln as well. He almost got that done, but Lincoln was saved. He created the boring, grainy car known as the Ford Falcon, which was Ford's first compact. They did sell well, but they were just basically cheap utilitarian vehicles, and they only lasted in the 60s mainly. He only wanted to sell Ford, so he probably would have went after Mercury eventually if he would have succeeded in getting rid of Lincoln. Thankfully for Ford, McNamara went to Washington in early 61, which allowed the Mustang program to continue. And it allowed Lincoln to live on because he probably would have kept going after Lincoln and Mercury as well. So even though he didn't like the Edsel, I don't think he killed it. People point to the changes made to the Edsel in 1959, but if we look at these from a proper standpoint, you will see that these changes really weren't generally for the worst. The first thing we're going to look at is that Ford changed the division structure. Edsel had its own separate division. They merged it in with the Mercury Lincoln division to build the Mercury Edsel Lincoln division. People say this hurt the Edsel, but I believe it helped it for two reasons. Number one, Edsel would share overhead with Mercury and Lincoln, meaning that Ford would save a lot of money on Edsels. Basically, if Edsel had its own division, that would have been more overhead, bigger losses to try to cover, which would have made it harder to justify keeping Edsel. So if you cut the overhead down, and that's what it doesn't cost you. Basically, when they cut the Edsel in 60, they didn't save much overhead cutting them because they're already part of the Mercury Edsel Lincoln division, and that overhead had to stay in place anyway. So this would have helped the Edsel division survive. Also, it would make it so Mercury and Edsel would not compete with each other as much because they were of the same division, so they would probably put their model lines against each other in such a manner that they really wouldn't be competing for the same customers as much. Another thing Ford did is it gave Ford and Mercury franchises to the Edsel dealerships to keep them afloat. People try to say that this took away from some of Edsel's specialness, but if the dealerships would not have been helped in this manner, they might have just went under. Edsel could not have survived if its dealership network collapsed. Ford kept it from collapsing by giving Ford and Mercury franchises to the Edsel dealerships. Another thing that they one thing they did that people do generally point to hurting the Edsel is that they discontinued the Corsair and Citation lines. Those lines only sold a little over 17,000 units, 17,769 in 1958. But they also, on the other side, discontinued the low-price Mercury Medalist line, which sold 18,732 units in 58. So in that exchange, Edsel got the better end of the change there, if you look at it in that manner. They also discontinued the 410 V8, but the 410 V8 was only used in the Corsair and Citation lines. It was the only engine available in those lines. They did add on a economy 6-cylinder on the Edsels, as well as a 292 and a 332 from Ford, while still keeping the 361 V8. The Ranger and Pacer models in 58 only had the 361. So in 59, they actually had 4 different engines to choose from. This would help Edsel because they could sell cars to people that were that wanted cars that were maybe more economical, or maybe they didn't want it. Because the 361, actually, the cars ran pretty decent with that, but maybe some people didn't want that hot rod car. They just wanted something that was nicer than a Ford, but they didn't quite want to pay for the Mercury. Adding these engine lines helped Edsel. And if you look at Chrysler at the time, the inline 6 put into Plymouth was also used in a Dodge, and were V8 engines that went across Plymouth, Dodge, and DeSoto all at the same time too. So it made sense to share engines rather than make unique engines for the Edsels. They did discontinue the problematic Teletouch transmission. Some people argue that this took away some of the specialness of Edsel, but these things just didn't work right. In the Motor Trend test, the one guy had one go out and be fully replaced after had it replaced, and then when the next one was starting to have issues as well. So in 4,200 miles, they replaced it once. They're starting to notice issues starting to creep back in after another couple thousand miles. So these things weren't good, and it made sense to get rid of them. The marketing budget was cut, which if you say, well, they cut marketing, man, they didn't really push them. But you have to remember, Edsel had a huge marketing campaign in 1958 to introduce it. Ford was not introducing a whole new line of cars in 1959. So they were introducing a whole new division like they did in 58. So of course it's going to cost a lot more money to bring the Edsel out. They pretty much just need marketing to maintain marketing for Edsel. The 59 Edsel budget was in line with what the Mercury's budget was in 59. So the budget being cut for marketing really isn't as big a hindrance as people like to make it out to be. To look at some things a little further on these changes, they say they're changing model lines. That's what they go down from 4 models to 2 models in their lines, but the 59 Buick was reorganized completely. They completely reorganized their whole lineup. In 58, Buick made a Special, a Super, a Century, a Roadmaster, and a Limited. Whereas in 59, they also made a LeSabre, an Invicta, and an Electra. So Buick cut 2 model lines as well. And if you look at styling for Buick, the 58 Buick is a lot more stylish and attractive vehicle than the 59. 58's in the middle of the screen, the 59's to the right. I especially don't care for the canted headlights on the 59. It's kind of just a weird looking car. So not only did Buick cut 2 model lines out completely, it renamed the existing model lines, and it had what I consider more objectionable styling. People also try to say there was a lack of distinction from the other Ford models. If you look at the pictures on the right, the upper left is a Fairlane, upper right's a Mercury, Fairlane, a Ford Fairlane, regular Ford, then a Mercury Monterey, then a Ford Thunderbird, and then you have the 58 Edsel on the bottom right. It definitely looks distinctive on the outside. It's probably more distinctive from the other model lines than they are from one another. So not only did the Edsel look different, it had its own unique engines. It had a 361 and a 410 that were not used in any other Ford products. It had the Edsel only Teletouch transmission. It had its own separate dealer network. It had a floating speedometer, a triple thermostat cooling system. The hood was hinged from the front and electronic hood release. There were also some other features to add that were Edsel specific. And remember, the Edsel was more different from the Ford and the Mercury. and the Pontiac was from the Chevy or Buick, or that the Dodge was from the Plymouth or DeSoto. So when they say there wasn't enough distinction, they're not really looking at what was out in the market at the time. It's probably more distinct than most cars out there. People also like to blame the name. The reason for this, I believe, is because Ford had a huge campaign to try to name the vehicle, and they spent a lot of time and money on it, and they eventually could not decide on any name, so they just called it the Edsel. But you have to remember that most car companies are named after the company founders. If someone comes out with a new car and puts their name on it, that name doesn't really mean anything. Sometimes they are named after historical figures, and it was argued that few outside Ford would know who Edsel Ford was. He was Henry Ford's son. But who would know who Hernando de Soto was, or Antoine Delamotte Cadillac at the time either? Cadillac found in Detroit. De Soto was the explorer who discovered the Mississippi River. It is true that Abraham Lincoln was well known for Lincoln, but Cadillac destroyed Lincoln and cells in the 50s, so certainly being named after a recognizable historical figure had nothing to do with being able to sell an automobile. Also, if you didn't know what it was, would Buick or Oldsmobile be good sounding names for a car company? Oldsmobile sounds like a car made for an old person. People know Oldsmobile because they know what it is, but if that name came out today, it probably, with no past to it at all, you would think that's not a good sounding name for a car. So basically, the name doesn't matter. I don't think Edsel was the best name they could have chosen, but I don't think it even hurt the car. It wasn't objectionable in any way. It didn't have anything you could rhyme with it in a derogatory manner. So I think that the name just didn't matter at all. A lot of people say timing. This one sounds like it really makes sense if you just look very shallow and don't take a long examination of it, because they'll say, well, there's a recession in 1958, overall sales were down 29.5%. These are both true, and it would make you think, well, you shouldn't release a car in this environment. But Edsel's only sold 31.6% of their lower expected sales. Ford planned between 200 and 400,000 Edsels per year. They only sold 63,000. Even if you adjust down for the recession, going from 200,000 units, cut it by 30%, go down to 140,000 units, Edsel still sold less than half of that many. So realistically, even adjusting for the recession, Edsel did poorly. Plymouth and DeSoto were both released right before the Great Depression, and both sold for decades. For years, Plymouth was the best-selling brand out of Chrysler. It wasn't really until they started just badge engineering Plymouths and Dodges as the same vehicle in the late 70s on that Plymouth kind of fell down from being Chrysler's best-selling make. Mercury was released during the Great Depression in 1939, and that car sold to 2011. Saturn was released in 1991, and it was successful until the government took over General Motors and decided to cut out some of the model lines and brands. So realistically, being released in a recession doesn't mean the car will be doomed for failure. Should also be noted that most makes recovered in 1959. Edsel sales fell 28.9% from what they were before then. So the Edsel still sold poorly even after the recession. A lot of people will say that there's just too much overlap with Ford and Mercury, that the Edsel didn't have a distinct price range to be sold in. The way they get to the Ford one is they generally don't compare like models. You got to realize that cars in the 1950s cost about 10% of what they cost today. So you pretty much be adding a zero onto these numbers. If you look at the Fairlane 500, which was Ford's top of the line model, not counting the Thunderbird, which didn't compete against bottom level Edsels, versus the Ranger, which was Edsel's bottom line make, you're looking usually about $150, going up to around $300 on most models. In fact, even the wagons are more than that. So the Edsel definitely was priced distinctly above the Ford. I chose the Sunliner convertible on the Fairlane because there was no retractable hardtop for the Edsel. It was a very expensive piece of technology at the time. And the Pacer convertible was the lowest priced Edsel convertible available. So that's why those two are compared to one another. The problem with the mid-priced overlap is that all companies had this. Because whereas people bought cars in the low-priced field for price mainly, they did like the style, some different styling and stuff. They were mainly for price. People bought cars in the mid-price field for image, and each division projected a different image from one another. The Edsel was built to actually compete against Pontiac and Oldsmobile to a point for the image those cars had, and Mercury was going up against Buick. The same was against Dodge and DeSoto, with Mercury going up against Chrysler. So there was some overlap in pricing, but you can see that GM with Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick had overlap. Same as Dodge, DeSoto, and Chrysler had overlap at Chrysler Corp. So the price overlap really didn't cause the Edsel to fail. The car was priced in the range where it should have been. If you look at this Ranger, it's priced between $2,500 and $2,900, and then you'd have more expensive models above that to start in some of these other price ranges. Plus, if the aforementioned three things were true, let's look at a 1958 Impala. It was an all-new model. The Chevrolet Impala was from the Chevrolet division. So that name, which most people don't even know what an Impala is, other than if they don't say a car, it's actually a type of African antelope. So it's a new name that people might have thought wasn't a very good name. In fact, I think Impala is a worse sounding name than Edsel if you think about it, if you don't know what either one is. It was Chevrolet reaching into the Pontiac market where it had never been before. So it probably had a worse overlap issue than what Edsel did. And it was released in the same exact recession as the Edsel was. In fact, the Edsel in 58 came out before I think the 58 Impala did. The Impala was only made in two versions, a hardtop coupe and convertible. When it's a hardtop coupe, it means there's no post hair between the glass. The glass will roll down. That's where a hardtop comes in. Yet the Impala sold over 181,000 units in 1958. And remember, there was no non-hardtop styling, which wouldn't look as good, but would drive more sales because it could be a discounted vehicle. There was no Impala wagon available. And there were no four-door Impalas available in 1958. They were all two-doors. The Edsel had a full line of cars, and the Impala outsold almost 3-1. The reason for this is because, number one, the Impala was a car that people liked the way it looked, and number two, it was a good quality car. The Edsel had these two failings, and that's why the Edsel failed, and the Impala was successful. On the Mercury car that most overlaps with Edsel, however, it's called the Mercury Medalist. This came in two-door and four-door sedan models only. You can see the poster, so they had no hardtop styling, which was what most people wanted in the mid-priced field. They had no wagons and no convertible models. They had a unique to the Medalist engine of a 312 cubic inch V8 that made 235 horsepower. The Ranger and Pacer had a 361, so it was a better performance car. The Medalist was also bigger and heavier, so even with the smaller engine, it probably didn't even help it with fuel mileage because weight hurts fuel mileage. Plus, the Medalist only sold 18,732 models. So even if you added that on to the Edsel, which not all of those would have went to the Edsel still would have failed in 58. And Ford also, once again, got rid of the Medalist to help Edsel out. So the overlap in the fields I don't think mattered. The way people come to that is they're not honest. They'll compare the lowest priced Edsel with the highest priced Ford, but the models wouldn't have been comparable to one another. Convertibles cost more, but someone buying a convertible to someone buying a two-door sedan, that's two different people. A lot of people say the Edsel should have been in a small economy car, and they'll usually point to the Volkswagen Beetle, and if they say, well, look at the Beetle, and people are like, well, yeah, the Beetle was a successful car, but you have to realize that the Volkswagen Beetle was introduced in the American market in 1950. It took it 10 years to work its way up to the 55,000 units it sold in 1958, and that was the best year it had up to that point. those 55,000 units were still about 8,000 units less than what Edsel sold. So if Ford would have introduced a car that was a small car like the Beetle, they would have stolen every single cell the Beetle had. It still would have been considered a failure if it would have sold all 55,000 units. It should be noted that the Volkswagen Beetle sold mainly in other markets. It didn't depend on the U.S. for sale. It didn't depend on sales in the United States for its survival. Those were just kind of like extra bonus sales. So the Volkswagen Beetle is a bad example, and it really would have been seen as a failure anyway. Next, I'll go to American Motors, but American Motors had a lot of different car lines. If you look at the car in the bottom left, that's the Nash Metropolitan. It sold 13,000 units in 1958. It's a small two-seat car. There really wouldn't have been a lot of room in that marketplace for Ford to be successful. A small two-seat car. The Rambler American in the upper right was a true compact car, but it only sold a little over 30,000 units. Once again, that's not a lot of units in a compact car market. And the Rambler 6 on the bottom right was actually a mid-sized car, which Ford didn't release mid-sized cars for quite a few years. And even that, the Rambler 6, and it did have a counterpart 8-cylinder model, sold another 10,000 units. Those cars, those were the only mid-sized cars on the market at the time. They're about the size of a 55 Chevy. So if Ford would have produced a car to match one of these market units, it would have had to, even if they would have released a car that was a mid-size to compete with the Rambler 6 and Rambler 8, they would have taken all those cells, and that still would have been below what they wanted. And it misses the actual point. A small car would have undercut Ford's basic product line when they had a large share of the market. Ford wasn't looking to increase its sales in the low-price field. It wanted to increase its sales in the mid-price field. Cars in the mid-price field were more profitable per unit, and Ford was actually getting beat very badly in the mid-price field, where it was doing quite well in the low-price field. And also, people don't realize that when they say this is small cars didn't sell in the 50s. These are, other than AMC, which was originally Nash, no American-made small car did well in the 50s. Notable failures, I'm starting in the car in the top left, and I'm going to work my way to the top right, then bottom left for the pictures of these vehicles. The first car is the Hudson Jet. It sold less than 36,000 units in 2 years. That would not have been seen as a success. The car, in many ways, this car is probably what killed Hudson. If they took the money they put in the Jet and put it into their full-size car, they might have been able to redesign it and get something that people wanted to buy. Their full-size cars were basically looking old by the time because they come out like 47 or 48. The Kaiser Henry J, which was sold for 5 years, and it did sell a respectable looking 130,000 units, but that's still, about 26,000 units per year, and most of those sold in 50 and 54. Once again, that was not a huge sales success. It did okay. The Crosley sold several different models. I have a wagon pictured here, but they also had a sedan and a sports car, and they only sold 85,000 units in about 10 years because there were 3 years in there where they didn't sell anything because of World War II, but you're looking at about 8,000 to 9,000 cars per year. That certainly wouldn't have made Ford happy to introduce a division full of cars on that. Plus, there's a lot of model lines there too. The Willys Jeepster, 18,000 units in 3 years. It's about 6 per year. The Willys Aero did decent. In 4 years, it sold 91,000 units. But you can add all these units up together, and Ford would have outsold this in 1 year. You're looking at probably about 350,000 units. You could take any year Ford had in the 1950s, and it would have beat all these combined. And these were all mostly lower priced cars. These weren't midline cars. They were basically cheap economy vehicles. Why did the people start buying small cars in the 60s? Very simply, standard models got bigger. In 1957, Chrysler released the Forward Look, and that set off design trends at the Big Three. The cars were longer and wider than they previously were. GM followed in 1959 and Ford followed in 1960. Chrysler's 1957 lineup is pictured here on the bottom left. You could get a 4 headlight design on the Chrysler, I believe, in certain areas. But basically, they made people like these cars. But this did lead to the small car boom in the 1960s because if you look at the graph, a 55 Bel Air was 196 inches long. In 5 years, the average, the Impala, which was the same size as the Bel Air, grew to 211 inches long. That's 15 inches. That's over a foot longer. The car was 7 inches wider and weighed considerably more. When Chevy released the Corvair, is 180 inches long and 67 inches wide and quite a bit lighter. So some people did want smaller, lighter, more fuel-efficient cars, but full-size cars still outsold all other model lines in the 60s and 70s. For the medium-price field comparison where Ford was trying to compete, if you look at Ford compared to GM, it was usually beat between GM sold about 4 or 5 cars for every one Ford sold in this lineup, pretty consistently around 4, but some years it was 5. Even after the Edsel was released, they still were beating them pretty good. Chrysler was outselling the Edsel 2-1 until 58. The reason for the big drop after 57 was because Chrysler had a lot of quality issues with the 57, so that hurt their sales quite a bit. But you can see GM didn't drop like the 50% Chrysler did. A 54 study showed when people who owned low-priced models moved up to the medium field, 87% of those that bought Chevys moved on to a Pontiac, a Buick, or an Oldsmobile. 77% of Plymouth owners bought a Dodge, a DeSoto, or a Chrysler, whereas only 26% of Ford owners bought a Mercury. So Chrysler was losing a lot of customers when they moved up to the medium field. If you look at the sales in the low price field, Chevy sold over 13 million cars, Ford sold over 12 million cars, Plymouth sold 5.5 million cars. So Ford was doing very well in the low priced field. In fact, they had about 40% of it, but they were missing on a lot of potential sales in the mid price field, which is the sole reason for the Edsel program to begin with. The Edsel program wasn't made to just sell more cars. It was made to get a bigger share of the mid-price market. And when people fail to actually recognize that, when they say, well, they shouldn't have went in that field, there's also people that try to say that that field was shriveling up, but you can see GM made a comeback by 59, and Chrysler made a comeback by 60, plus a lot of these makes are still around. Buick, Dodge, and Chrysler are still around. Pontiac and Mercury around until just a few years ago. Oldsmobile wasn't that long ago, they got rid of that one either. So the mid-price field did quite well in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s and 90s. So that market didn't just shrivel up, which is what a lot of people try to say. So I think I presented why the Edsel failed. In my opinion, once again, it was mainly quality. They couldn't get past the bad quality, and also poor styling. And the other reasons people give are kind of just, I think what they're trying to do is they like the Edsel, so they're looking for something other than saying it was a bad quality car or a bad looking car, so they're looking for these other reasons to say this is why it failed. It had nothing to do with those things, which is obviously untrue. I want to thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment, and have a great day.